When we look at the first years of presidents in our country, the first 32 out of 36 years were with Virginian slaveholders in the presidency. Our voting system was founded on slavery, and that's a little bit tough to swallow. However, it's the truth. Many people think that our voting system was based off of equal representation between populated areas versus less populated areas. However, it really began in the 18th century as more of a issue between the North versus the South, and those who believed in slavery and those who didn't believe in slavery. So our voting system is set up on a basis of electors, not a direct popular vote. And so it was founded as a way, as an alternative to a direct popular vote, whereas states have a certain number of what we call electors representing each state instead of a direct vote, one person, one vote for the presidency. So I really dug into this topic when considering in this last election, there was a lot of debate amongst friends and family about the Electoral College and why we don't use a direct popular vote. And my interest was piqued because I actually realized I didn't quite understand the history or the rationale. I also heard from someone about the 3/5 count for slaves, where slaves counted as less than people in order for more votes for the South to count. So that piqued my interest. And then also just realizing that in my 30s, I don't know what the Electoral College stands for and why it is still currently used. And so I decided to research the topic, and I'm sharing it with you here today. I really want to dig in and share from my research both the founding as well as the basis in slavery of the Electoral College, and why it is still the method that we use today. Chérie, il faut attendre. So first, we're going to look at the founding. So really, the founders of the Constitution did believe they were creating a system that was fair for the citizens. It really seems from my research that it wasn't intended to be something that was unequal amongst the citizens of the founding United States. So at Times Magazine expose in 2016 really illustrated that in the 18th century, the main form of rule was monarchical. And so it was fiefdoms and kingdoms. And so the United States was really building something from scratch. And so the founders of the Constitution were doing their best, but there really wasn't another country to look to as an example. The idea was to channel a popular vote. And so to really get the popular vote sentiment of the citizens. However, there was concern about doing a direct popular vote, and that could become tyrannical if you have a super powerful leader who convinced very populated areas to be swayed. The idea, if you had a little bit more nuanced of a system to more equally represent the different areas, would be more fair and less tyrannical. And the basic parameters of the founding of the system was that each state would have a set number of electors based off of the number of representatives in the Senate and in the House for each of the states. And there would be a total of those two, and it would be a number per state. And the majority in each state would then get that total number of electorates as a vote for the presidency, and that the candidate would need the highest number of the Electoral College in order to win. And the other tenet was that most states went by this. There's 48 out of 50 who abide by this, is that the popular vote in that state is an all or nothing deal. And so the popular vote gets that total number of electors for that state for the presidency. So in 1787, when the founders of the Constitution were reviewing how we would vote for a president, they were looking at a bunch of different systems. They were looking at potentially having Congress vote for a president instead of citizens. They were looking at potentially having governors vote. They also looked at a direct popular vote. And there was a lot of back and forth. There was a lot of discussion. And really, the Electoral College was seen as a happy medium between having elected officials and direct citizen popular vote take place. So it was seen as a middle ground. Michael Ullman is a historian who wrote several articles in the National Review about the Electoral College, and he really highlights how the Electoral College system supports our whole governmental system in the United States. So our two-party system, he also argues that it's a essential piece of the federal system of government. And I also had to look up federalism. So federalism really is just a political system that combines both a central form of government as well as regional governments, so state governments, county governments, regional politics. And it's seen as a good way to balance power of different areas in such a large nation. So now that we've looked at a little bit of the landscape, we are going to look at the role that slavery played. So the Electoral College really in the beginning favored slaveholders. So there was more voting power for the South. And the reason for this is if it was a direct popular vote, there were more Northern voters than Southern voters. And the reason for this is because slaves weren't allowed to vote. And so by creating an electoral system where you were creating electors per state and including slaves as part of the count, even though they only counted as 3/5 of a person, you actually gave more power to slaveholding states. And then if it was just a straight number of voters voting. I was researching this and came up with this information from a Stanford historian, Jack Rakov, who says that without that 3/5 count for slaves, a direct vote would have hurt the South. And back to my original statistic of 32 of the first 36 years of the Constitution, the presidency was held by a Virginian slaveholder. That would have certainly been different if it had been a direct popular vote deciding the presidency. So in a system that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person and where there were electors per state, ironically, the more slaves, the more electors per state. And so slaveholding states actually benefited by taking on and buying more slaves. Time Magazine, again, this article in 2016, they talked about how Thomas Jefferson in the 1800 election, it was widely thought that he rode into the presidency, quote, on the backs of slaves. Now that we've looked at both the founding and the basics in slavery, we are going to move on to why and how is this used today? So despite the ugliness with the basis in slavery, the Electoral College has been deemed to be a solid way to choose our presidency even today. So the Electoral College is how we vote for president in 2020. This is how it just took place a few weeks ago. So despite polls, most Americans in the polls actually would like to do away with the Electoral College. However, the general expert consensus is that if you were to do away with the Electoral College, you would do away with the entire American political system. And I think one thing I've thought of in not knowing before much about the Electoral College is I think a lot of that sentiment that comes up in the polls could be attributed to a lack of education. And I know that's certainly the case for myself. It was interesting to learn that really this Electoral College is in line with keeping a separation of powers in government. It's also keeping that concept of federalism, the combined influence of both a centralized government and regional government. It supports a lot of the integrity of the whole democratic process in the United States. So the Electoral College supports the two-party system, and it forces it. The thing that the two-party system is that it does in our country is that it forces candidates to consider the whole country. We don't have these many different factions of politics going on. You have this unified, nationwide, one party and another party option. This Electoral College creates a system where the president has to really try to gain the votes of the entire country. And if the votes for presidency only came from a few heavily populated areas, they then wouldn't be as just or as effective as a leader for the entire large United States. So really, the goal was to create a president that was speaking for the entire nation. The other thing is, in line with that, is that the Electoral College keeps power spread throughout the country. So by having presidents and potential presidential candidates vie for the votes across the country, they then are representing the needs of the entire country. So now that we have a better understanding of the Electoral College, its employment today, its founding, its basis in slavery, and really the continuity of why it was important at the founding of the Constitution and why it continues to be important in how we elect presidents today, I hope that you will be more well-versed when you are speaking with friends and family, when you're having conversations about politics, and to have a better gauge on why the American system is the way it is. In conclusion, the Electoral College was a huge pivot in the 18th century from monarchical rule and monarchical elections. And it was indeed founded on racist beliefs and on slavery. However, it also had sound reasoning for why it was created to represent a diverse nation. Initially, it was to represent the diversity between the North and the South in beliefs. And I would say now, today, allows for a broad representation across the entire country, across heavily populated areas and rural areas. And I certainly have learned a lot from this, and I hope you have too. Thank you.